Members of a grooming gang in Huddersfield have been given lengthy jail sentences after being convicted of rape and other sex attacks against vulnerable girls. 15 girls, the oldest of whom was 17 and the youngest just 11, were abused by the gang of 20 men over a period of several years. Gerard Tubb reports.
Huddersfield has joined an infamous list of English towns and cities where young, vulnerable white girls have been groomed for sexual abuse by groups of men, often of Muslim and British Pakistani heritage. Between 2004 and 2011, in Huddersfield houses, on takeaway premises, in cars and even at the side of the road, 15 girls were groomed, drugged, abused and raped.
The men who have been convicted of these appalling crimes deliberately targeted their victims because of their vulnerability. They groomed them and exploited them for their own sexual gratification.
In all, 20 men have been convicted. One of the ringleaders, Amir Singh Dhaliwal, who has since become a Sikh, was jailed for life and told by the judge, "Your treatment of these girls was inhuman." Many of the victims here in Huddersfield were just 11 or 12 years old when the abuse started, and they were all vulnerable for family or other reasons. One said her abuser thought she was a slag and said the gang called the girls hood rats. The most widespread example of grooming gang abuse was in Rotherham, where an estimated 1,500 girls were targeted.
I refuse to accept that lessons have been learned until I get the reassurance that every perpetrator is off the street and every child is protected. And I'm sorry, we are still having current cases that are being reported. Some of them are not being taken seriously, and we still have perpetrators out there.
You haven't watched this? You haven't watched this? Can you get me a solicitor? Can you get me a solicitor?
The trials of these 20 men were the focus of a protest in May by the far-right activist Tommy Robinson, who was jailed for breaching a blanket ban on reporting the trials. He was subsequently freed on appeal, and his case will be heard again next week.
The victims say that you failed them. You failed to protect them.
The Children's Services Director for Huddersfield said a report has been commissioned into what went wrong, but he wouldn't answer any questions, and neither would the police. Gerard Tubb, Sky News, Huddersfield.
Good evening. 20 men have been found guilty of being part of a grooming gang that raped and abused girls in Huddersfield over a 7-year period. The men, mostly of Pakistani heritage, were convicted of more than 120 offences against 15 girls. The youngest of them was just 11. The girls were plied with drink and drugs, and some were abandoned on the Yorkshire moors. From Leeds Crown Court, Danny Savage reports.
A bus station, the car park of a DIY store in Huddersfield, a lonely moorland, just a few of the places where vulnerable children were groomed and sexually abused by men of mainly Pakistani heritage. So many men were involved that 3 trials were needed. A judge has now ruled that 20 who were convicted can now be publicly identified. One of them was Muhammad Ibra, nicknamed Bully, a huge man who used his physical presence to intimidate. One of his victims was thrown out of his car when she refused to give in to his depraved demands.
He kept punching me and punching me. It felt like my nose was broken. They kicked me and I got out of the car and I started running. I jumped over the fence and I started running down the moors. Then I ran back up and then saw them drive off. I had to jump in front of a car covered in blood at 4 a.m. in the morning to get a lift back to Huddersfield.
The ringleader, Amir Singh Dhaliwal, was jailed for life and told he must serve a minimum of 18 years. The judge said his treatment of the girls was inhuman. One scenario which kept cropping up in these cases is that victims were driven up here onto the moors at night. If they didn't do what their abusers told them to, they were beaten up and dumped. Imagine being a child left in this wilderness, in the dark, having been physically and sexually assaulted by someone you thought cared for you.
It's a very frightening place. There's just so much moorland up here, it can be anywhere, can people.
This farmer vividly remembers distressed teenage girls knocking on the door of his remote hilltop home. Over the years, he's had to take several to safety.
As I looked out, there were three girls. Obviously looked roughed up and confused. They didn't know where they were and they asked, can they come in and could I help them?
And what was the impression you got of what had happened to them?
It looked like they'd been knocked about with somebody. Yeah, something funny, something very suspicious had been happening. I could tell by the hair it was everywhere and they were just uncontrollable crying.
She would come home disorientated, scratches, bites.
The mother of one schoolgirl victim told us what everyday life was like.
On one occasion she came home and her neck was completely black with bites from one side to the other. A taxi had just pulled up outside and pushed her out. I could see another girl in the back and then it just drove off. I changed my hours so I could pick her up after school. I used to dread bank holidays when I knew she was going to be at home and I couldn't monitor her.
Victims and their families said they repeatedly told West Yorkshire Police what was happening here, but no arrests were made until years later. Today, the force refused to answer criticism from the prosecution that their conduct was disgraceful. The local council says it all happened when child sexual exploitation was effectively ignored.
These crimes took place a number of years ago, at a time when, as we know sadly from other cases in other parts of the country, that the issue of child sexual exploitation was not well defined or understood. Since then, lessons have been learned.
Most of the men so far sentenced for this litany of abuse have each been jailed for at least 15 years. Another 4 defendants will be sentenced next month. Danny Savage, BBC News, West Yorkshire.
And our home editor, Mark Easton, is with me. And what is so desperate, Mark, listening to that, is that we have seen cases similar to this over the last few years.
Rotherham, Oxford, Rochdale, Derby, Banbury, Telford, Peterborough, Aylesbury, Bristol, Halifax, Keighley, Newcastle, Huddersfield. This is a familiar scandal, the sexual abuse of vulnerable children in English towns by groups of men of predominantly Pakistani heritage, but others too. It went on for decades, but only really in the last 5, 6, 7 years have people taken proper notice. Indeed, it's a crime that until recently we've rarely discussed in public. Child sexual abuse is often ignored or covered up. The protection of institutional reputations or the protection of community cohesion has been put before the protection of children. And the grooming gangs of provincial England have tended to operate where the disinfectant of public scrutiny fails to reach poorer neighbourhoods on the edge of town, around the minicab ranks and the fast food joints, the twilight zones of urban life. And child abuse thrives in dark corners where people look the other way or don't ask difficult questions. But when we do look, we find schoolmasters and care workers, priests and TV presenters, shopkeepers and minicab drivers. When we look, we find. And the only crumb of comfort from this deeply painful process is that by exposing the canker at the heart of our society, we so belatedly are making our children hopefully a little bit safer.
Mark, thank you. Mark Easton.
Good evening. Huddersfield today joined the list of towns and cities forever linked with the grooming and abuse of young girls. Between 2004 and 2011, a gang of 20 men, mainly of Pakistani heritage, systematically targeted vulnerable girls, the youngest just 11 years old. Jailing the gang for a total of more than 200 years, the judge said their offending exceeded anything he'd ever encountered. They treated them as commodities, he said, and passed them around for their own sexual gratification. The case bore horrific echoes of some of those that came before, with the girls' repeated calls for help, once again, ignored.
Convicted and jailed for crimes against more than a dozen vulnerable teenage girls, these were the men, all but one of Pakistani heritage, who groomed those girls and then abused them. Today, for the first time, it can be reported, and the scale of their offending can finally come to light. One of the survivors of that abuse agreed to speak to ITV News alongside her mother, and she told me how she was targeted as a shy 13-year-old schoolgirl.
How did it make you feel? Did they make you feel special?
At first, yeah. And then it was just like I just get passed around and just get made feel so small.
What are your thoughts about the men who could do that to a 13-year-old girl?
The vile. I don't know, I can't really describe them any other way.
The crimes took place in Huddersfield, but also in the remote moorland surrounding the town, where the victims were sometimes simply left to find their own way home. Police paid tribute to the women who came forward to give evidence in court.
That's taken nearly a year to conclude, having to bravely repeat their accounts, and in some cases several times over. I cannot praise them enough for their courage and tenacity in helping secure justice.
These trials are the latest in a series of convictions of grooming gangs across the country. In Rotherham, it's thought that more than 1,500 victims were abused over a 16-year period. In Oxford, there were 373. In Rochdale, 47 girls were abused, and in Newcastle the estimate is 700 victims. This victim told me her first complaint to police of her ordeal was lost and ignored. Unlike some others, she had a loving family and a stable home life, but parents who had no idea what was happening when she went out.
At the time, I didn't actually believe that anything like that would happen within my family. I didn't even understand that that type of thing was going on.
Is this the problem, that you simply didn't know that this kind of thing even happened?
Definitely. I didn't have any idea. Even today, I can't understand how anybody can inflict such cruelty on another person.
And from one mother whose love has helped rebuild her family, a warning to those who think it couldn't happen to them.
It can happen to anybody. It's not, it doesn't matter what type of life you have. It doesn't matter if you're parents, if you're in a single parent family, or it can happen to absolutely anybody.
So Huddersfield becomes the latest town to learn the scale of suffering inflicted on its young girls. A judge called the abuse vile and wicked and said the attackers showed no remorse. The victims have shown nothing but courage to bring them to justice. Damon Green, News at 10, Huddersfield.